Thank you all for joining us and welcome to the release of the Soil Health Partnership's first ever cover crop planting report. The Soil Health Partnership is a program of the National Corn Growers Association and serves as their flagship sustainability program. Today, SHP lead scientist Dr. Maria Bowman, along with SHP field manager for Northern Illinois and Wisconsin, and resident cover crop authority Jim Isermann will walk us through the report results and share insights on key findings. And at the end, they will take time for questions. Maria, can you first tell us how SHP's work in soil health is different from other organizations, but how you work together with partners?
Sure, Heather. Our mission at the Soil Health Partnership is to promote the adoption of soil health practices for economic and environmental benefit. As you said already, SHP is a program of National Corn Growers Association, and we're under the Stewardship Action Team, and we serve as their flagship sustainability program. I think what really distinguishes SHP is that we're farmer-led and farmer-focused. That means that each farmer in the SHP network works with a regional field manager as they try a new soil health management practice. So typically that's no or reduced tillage, cover crops, nutrient management, or grazing. And they'll work with that field manager to design a trial to compare their conventional management practice or system to a new soil health practice or system. And then we collect data to evaluate the impact of that practice change. Currently, the SHP Research Network spans 16 states and more than 200 farmers. And the success of our network is really due to partnerships, as you mentioned. And since the very beginning, we've relied on those partnerships. We were founded in 2014 through a pretty unique partnership between the Nature Conservancy, Bayer, the Environmental Defense Fund, and the National Corn Growers Association. And we also work with commodity groups, nonprofits, government agencies at the state and national level. So another group of partners that's super important to me is scientists and academic researchers. As we're building this data set, we're working with them to help evaluate our protocols and also to analyze data along with us.
Thanks for providing that background. What was the objective for this new cover crop planting report?
The idea behind the survey was to provide some context both for the farmers within our network, but also for outside partners and the public to provide context on cover crop usage practices and costs. I think we understand that in order to get a better handle on the costs and benefits of cover crops on the farm, we need to collect data to contribute to that understanding, especially about what types of cover crops and cover crop management practices are working for the farmers in our network. And this survey, combined with some of the other types of data that we collect, like yield data, soils data, and other agronomic data, will help answer some of the important questions we have about how cover crops impact soil health, agronomic outcomes like yield, and very importantly, profitability. So we're really excited about learning about how these practices contribute to successful outcomes.
Jim, why is there so much interest around cover crops when it comes to soil health?
Well, cover crops are becoming popular for many reasons, but farmers are coming back to that idea that the way they manage their soils can really affect the way that soil functions. And if we can improve the function of our soil, we can improve a lot of outcomes, both agronomically and environmentally. So many farmers start off taking those first steps towards soil health with no-till and reduced tillage systems, and they see some benefits there. And then that next logical step is to add that cover crop, add that living root back into the system. And that can really make a lot of the benefits stand out even more. So the goal is trying to, achieve better water infiltration, build organic matter. There's a whole lot of different things that growers are looking for. And as we begin to understand the soil systems better, those cover crops become that next kind of step in order to improve our soil health and all the environmental outcomes that come along with it.
Maria, tell us about the respondents of the survey.
We have more than 80 farmers across 11 states respond to our survey, giving us information about cover crops on their trial sites. It's important to remember that this is a subset of the farmers that we're working with, so only a portion of our farmers are working with cover crops. And also, we looked at the farmers that responded between November 2019 and March of 2020. When we think about the typical farmer in our network, they're usually a medium to large sized operation. Common rotations are corn, soybean, wheat, corn on corn. And a lot of different tillage practices are represented, but I'd say a higher than average adoption of no-till or reduced tillage in our network. One thing I would say that's true of all of the farmers represented here is that they're innovators. Each of the farmers responding to this survey is out there experimenting with cover crop management practices on their farm as they try to really dial in those practices that are going to work for them on their land and in their management system.
Now, Jim, how will farmers be able to utilize the information we're about to share?
Well, as Maria mentioned, this is still something where cover crop users are really innovating. Cover crops are still at a very low level of use across the country. So all these farmers are really starting off with relatively new systems. So we really want to see this type of information come out so that they can start making better decisions in terms of how to get cover crops established and how do those cover crops ultimately affect the agronomic implications the following year when we're actually planting cash crops into that. So this is the beginning of understanding how all that fits together when we record information, simple things like the dates that farmers are applying cover crops and the different species. These are all things that still have a lot of work to be done to understand what the most effective way to get a cover crop established. So we're really looking forward to using this information, especially down the line as we have more and more growers in the program and we're diversifying over more states and cropping systems. It's really going to add a lot to what farmers can take a look at in a resource to understand what is the best way to be successful at cover crops.
And the report focused around timing, species, and the cost of cover crops. So let's talk first about the timing. Maria, what were the key findings around the timing of cover crops?
So most farmers planted their cover crop after they harvested their cash crop, no surprise, but 25% of farmers actually responded that they interseeded or overseeded the cover crop into a standing cash crop. So that means that they seeded that cover crop before they harvested the cash crop. And you can see that show up in the planting dates that they reported. So more than half of farmers planted between the middle of September and the beginning of November, but almost 40% planted before or after those dates. So there's a big range of strategies and timing to get those cover crops out in the fields, especially maybe in higher latitudes or different crop rotations where there are timing or labor constraints to getting a cover crop in after harvest.
Yes, time and labor availability are often the constraints when it comes to being able to utilize cover crops. So, Jim, how are farmers overcoming that?
Well, there's a few things in the report that I think kind of contribute to understanding how farmers are overcoming that. But one of the big things that stands out is the amount of growers that are looking to using a custom operator in order to get the job done. And this is an important aspect because farmers are extremely busy. Best laid intentions in the springtime. Once harvest comes along, we're planting cover crops. The implication of a cover crop is that the farmer also has a cash crop, right? We're not harvesting the cover crop to pay the bills. We're harvesting the cash crop. And when fall comes around, the important thing is to get that cash crop harvested in a timely manner. And, getting the cover crop in is important to these growers. They want to get things done, but it can be very difficult. So seeing that move towards a lot of growers, finding a custom operator who is able to come out and apply those cover crops for them, it takes them out of the responsibility of the farmer's hand. It's one less thing they have to worry about. And we see a number of operations kind of sprouting up where people are taking on, that custom seeding operations as kind of a side job or something to provide extra income for other farmers or retailers. So I think that's a big move in the industry and something that's going to be very beneficial as we start to get more and more operators out there who are equipped and able to get cover crops out there.
And the seeding method can affect the cost of planting a cover crop in addition to how well it establishes. Maria, do you know the breakdown of the seeding methods that farmers used?
We do. So in addition to asking them about when they planted their cover crop, we asked them how they planted it. And in our network, the most common seeding method was actually drilling in that cover crop. And that was used by 47% of farmers. The next most common seeding method was broadcasting that cover crop seed out there, used by 32% of farmers. And it's about half and half for the folks that are broadcasting and incorporating versus just broadcasting. And the third most common method was actually aerial seeding, or flying that cover crop seed on, and that was used by 14% of farmers. And the last 7% are using some other kind of seeding method or a row crop planter of some type to get that seed out there.
And Jim, what does that tell us about cover crop planting techniques?
Well, there's a lot in here to kind of pick apart, and in future surveys, hopefully we can dive a little deeper into what all this is. But looking at things such as broadcasting, for example, is a fairly quick and inexpensive way for farmers to get out there and get things going. So by breaking it down and understanding how farmers are going about getting the cover crops out there, and this is going to vary quite a bit by year as well, as we see different challenges that come up with different years. This is going to be something that is going to vary from year to year. Drilling is by far probably one of the more consistent ways to get a stand, and so we see that represented pretty heavily by having 47% of the farmers going that route, because that is probably the best way to get a cover crop established. But at the same time, it can be kind of slow and a little more labor intensive. So we see those farmers move into some other methods in order to achieve their goals of getting that cover crop out there, something like a broadcast or even an aerial application, as we just mentioned a few minutes ago about using a custom operator. One of the advantages of aerial application is, having someone outside the farmer getting it applied, and that management implication of not needing to get it in right after harvest in that tight window. So there's a lot to be picked out of this type of a data set.
Now, Jim, we'd be remiss if we didn't address the abundance of moisture that we had in 2019. How did that play into this data?
Well, it certainly is going to have affected a lot of things, particularly in the dates in which the cover crops were established, which we saw was obviously very variable. Within the data set, I don't think we had a whole lot of actually prevented plant acres. Most of our plots did get in. So we don't see a whole lot affected in that regard. But even looking at this percentage of aerial application, given the nature of our plots, the way they're set up, we typically see very little aerial application. So even seeing this, I think, is a sign of farmers adopting to what we had last year in 2019, which was late planting and therefore late harvest. And many of them looking at it and saying, hey, the best way to get a cover crop in this year is to look at that aerial application or interseeding application. So I think that's something that normally in a more normal year, if there is such a thing, normal year, that we would probably see that number a little bit lower. But that's just a reaction of the farmers getting out there and making sure that they're getting the job done and using some of those different tools in the toolbox to do so.
I see. Let's next talk about species. And Maria, when it comes to species, mixes are popular.
Yes, they are. So 53% of the farmers that reported planting a cover crop mix had at least 2 species, and a subset of those farmers, or 22% of all farmers, planted a cover crop with a more diverse mix, so more than 3 species. And, although most of our farmers planted a single species, we saw that cereal rye was common across both mixes and single species planters. So I think that's one thing that really came out of this was the popularity of cereal rye. So 80% of those planting a single species planted cereal rye, and it was present in 50% of the mixes. And after cereal rye, the next 4 most popular species that we saw were oats, rapeseed, radish, and clover in order. We saw a lot of oats and radish mixes, but a lot of diversity in those mixes.
Jim, what are the advantages of these mixes?
There's quite a few advantages to looking towards mixes. Part of it is farmers are understanding the value of biodiversity out there. They get started oftentimes with something like cereal rye, and they see the advantages, and that's adding, one new species of root out there and plant. But real quickly, they get interested in trying to bring some more diversity out there and get some of the advantages of some of the other cover crops that are out there. It also helps to spread risk quite a bit. So when we want to try to take advantage of some of these other cover crops, for example, a legume, most farmers understand that, legumes can provide nitrogen and they can do a lot of good things for the soil. But sometimes we struggle to get them established and to get some good value out of them. So by simply mixing them in with something like cereal rye, we can kind of get the best of both worlds, kind of spread our risk out. We do see most of our fields are primarily corn, soybean fields that we're putting in a cool season cover crop mix. So as we start to talk about mixes we're seeing those 2 to 3 species mixes. We occasionally do see some of those more complex mixes when they're planted behind a small grain, some of the 6 to 12 way mixes. But oftentimes that's something that many of our farmers are doing maybe in their other fields, not necessarily in their SHP plots.
And Jim, cereal rye is awfully popular. Why is that?
Yeah, cereal rye, hands down, is the most common. Obviously, here the most common cover crop in our plots, but probably the most common cover crop across the nation, and that's because of its just flat out reliability. We're typically trying to get a cover crop established post harvest, so after a corn and soybean harvest, and it's the one that can be seeded really late and still give us good overwintering. So farmers see a result of it. They see the next spring something's going to come up. So we have some other options with cover crops. They can sometimes give us some issues with establishment, but cereal rye is one that just about every year we see it come up in the springtime, and we're going to get some kind of benefit out of it for our work of spending money on the seed. In addition to that, the seed isn't very expensive. It's not too bad to terminate chemically. Some farmers do get a little concerned just simply with the fact that it will overwinter, but nonetheless, we do usually want to see that overwintering so we can get some benefits out of it. And it's one that for the most part, we can terminate it pretty easily, and a lot of farmers start off with it ahead of soybeans. There's some management implications if you're trying to do it ahead of a corn crop, but ahead of a soybean crop, we don't seem to have too many issues if we want to go in there and no-till soybeans into it. So it has a lot of advantages and a lot of reliability.
Well, speaking of cost, the item of great interest is cost associated with cover crops. Maria, what did you ask SHP farmers about this?
So Heather, we asked farmers to approximate how much they spent on cover crop seed and also how much they spent getting that cover crop out there. So we know there's a lot of variability in how much farmers are spending depending on what they're putting in and how they're seeding. So we were really interested to see what these numbers looked like across our network. And there was a lot of variability in cost depending on the species and the seeding method, but the median cost of cover crop seed was about $15 an acre, and the cost to apply it was about $12 an acre.
I see. Tell us more about how species affected these costs.
So no surprise, different types of cover crop seed can be more or less expensive, and typically a more diverse mix is going to cost more. And we definitely see that reflected in the costs that farmers reported. So the median seed cost for cover crop mixes with more than 3 species was around $22.50 an acre, whereas the median seed cost for single species cover crops was much lower, about $14 an acre.
And we talked a lot about the seeding method. How does the seeding method then affect the cost?
So as Jim mentioned earlier, drilling in that cover crop can contribute to getting better cover crop establishment and maybe larger benefits as a result, but it's important to consider that it can be more expensive. Farmers reported that it's cheapest to broadcast that cover crop seed, runs about $10 an acre, and it's more expensive to drill it, running about $14.50 an acre, and aerial seeding somewhere in between. And running that drill across the field can require more time, and there's also more equipment costs, maintenance and repair associated with that drill. And the cost effectiveness too of the broadcasting can be higher because farmers might be combining getting that seed out there with other operations like spreading fertilizer or tillage, as Jim mentioned. So it can definitely affect the cost, how you get it out.
And Jim, this survey is just part of broader research that SHP facilitates on cover crops. Can you tell us a little bit more about how these data will be used to answer questions farmers and others might have about cover crops?
Yeah, I think one of the big things here is we're starting to take that step away of just kind of talking generically about cover crops. We're really going to be able to use this to pair it with a lot of our other data to start understanding, the effectiveness of a cover crop when we put a cover crop out there. Are we getting good establishment? Are we getting overwintering? When's the best time, the best management implications in order to get an effective cover crop? So we're going to match this up with our other data sets, such as just collecting the yield and the soils data that we've always done. We're also working to get out and do some more collecting of data in the springtime and really zero in on the agronomic implications that the cover crop can have when we're planting our cash crops in the springtime. So measuring the effects of soil temperatures and stand counts and things like that. So this is kind of that base, that beginning of really understanding what the farmers are doing, and then matching it with the rest of the data set to see what is really coming out as being successful, so that we can help farmers ultimately make management decisions and give them more precise information in regards to the individual cover crops and methods and dates and things that they're using.
Let's see. We now have a few minutes to answer questions. If you would like to ask a question, please utilize the Q&A button at the bottom if you are joining us via Zoom. And if you are joining us via Facebook, please leave it in the comments and we will find those as well. Please include your name, the question, and if you are the media, please include the company you represent. While we wait on those questions to come in, if you would like to download the entire report, it is available now at the link on the screen here. And if you are joining us via Facebook, you should be able to find the link now in the comments. So we encourage you to go and download the entire report to see all the items that we talked about today. Looks like we have one question that came in just a few minutes ago that we'll go ahead and take while we allow the other ones to come in. Is there any intention to calculate the financial benefits of cover cropping to make the business case for this practice? Maria, would you like to start that? I know we have some other data that has been utilized that maybe you can speak about in a separate business case, and then Jim, feel free to add in your comments as well.
Sure. So in January of this year, we published a business case featuring an Indiana farmer, Mike Bias, and we also have a podcast on that business case where we talk about the weed control benefit of his cover crop. And this is definitely something that we're working on generating across our whole network. But in that business case, we talked about his experience, which was a reduction in herbicide costs associated with adopting a wheat cover crop. And I think we know that there can be benefits associated with cover crops, but it's oftentimes a little harder to measure than just asking farmers how much they spent. So this is also something that we're working on contributing to, both through yield data to accurately characterize the impacts on yield, but also importantly, those potential reductions in input costs that might be associated with the cover crop. So I'd say look for more on that from us over the next couple of years.
Jim, would you like to add anything to that?
Not especially, other than that it is absolutely the beginning of that economic side of things, and even understanding the cost, because one of the big things that farmers are going to start off with is what is this expense associated with it, and how can we make sure that we're being very effective in the cover crop that we put out there and managing that particular expense and getting the cover crop out there. So it is a beginning step towards that, getting a more in-depth look, but it does start with that very basic expense of, well, what do I have to pay to get this cover crop out there? And that's something that farmers are very interested in. They want to know, bottom line, what's it going to cost me to do this? So I think it'll be important information.
Yeah, and to follow up on Maria's comments, you can find more on that business case at soilhealthpartnership.org. There is a blog and a podcast, and you can find the full report there on the website. We had a couple other questions come in. First off, did farmers need to apply more nitrogen to the following cash crop because of the cover crop tied up some of it in the soil?
I can probably take that one. So certainly when we're talking about planting a corn crop into an existing cover crop stand, we have to be very careful with our nitrogen management that's going on there. It's going to depend on what cover crop we have ahead of that, but particularly, as we mentioned, cereal rye is an extremely popular cover crop. I kind of gave the caveat a little bit earlier that you need to have particular management of if you're going to plant corn into cereal rye. And one of those management strategies is having more upfront nitrogen. We're typically not looking at adding nitrogen into the overall system, but we need to be aware of what's going on in that early season, both in regards to the cereal rye tying up nitrogen, but also just in regards to we're not tilling the soil, we're not releasing as much nitrogen as we would in a full tillage system. So we see farmers, when they switch to no-till systems, they're hopefully taking that step on their corn of applying some starter or pop-up nitrogen. And then if they're going to take another step and start planting corn into grass cover crops, we really do need to step up some more nitrogen up front to get around those problems. But again, if we're looking at something like a winter kill cover crop system, or possibly the farmer is able to get a good legume established, then that's a little bit of a different story. But nutrient and nitrogen management is extremely important when we're talking about planting corn, both in a no-till system and then also when we add cover crops.
Thank you, Jim. We have a couple more questions, three more that are in line. Next is Jerry Dove. He is asking if there were seeding rates for two-way cereal rye and rapeseed.
I can start with that one, and then Jim, you can jump in. We didn't specifically break out seeding rates for all of the different kinds of mixes in the report, but we did report on average seeding rates for cereal rye that we saw in our network. And the average seeding rate for cereal rye was about 48 pounds per acre. And there was a lot of variability in how densely folks put the seed out there. Jim, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I could just give you a quick numbers, just working with the growers, typically what they're looking at. Rapeseed has been added to a lot of mixes, particularly over the last 4 to 5 years, because it's extremely cheap and it's small seeded. And many of them are just adding 1 to 2 pounds to a cereal rye mix in order to get themselves some more diversity. It does frequently overwinter. It is a brassica, but it can be planted a lot later than things such as radishes and turnips. So a lot of farmers are turning to that, and frequently just throwing 1 to 2 pounds in order to kind of up the diversity that's within the mix. So adding it to something like cereal rye.
Thank you. Next up is Lynn from Michigan State University, who's joined us today. She is wondering if you've seen water conservation's benefits being brought on by the cover crops, especially in this year's cash crop, given the current heat wave that we are experiencing.
So unfortunately, it's been really hot, and I haven't been out to see some of the benefits of some of the soil moisture retention that should be going on. So certainly in the springtime, we saw some issues that hopefully won't be a long-term implication this year. But cover crops do retain moisture, which, depending on the time of year, is a good thing. In the springtime, sometimes we need to work on mitigating that through different management practices, strip tillage, or early termination. And then about this time of year, usually things are starting to get pretty hot and dry, and we can start to reap some of the benefits of having those cover crops out there. So unfortunately, I don't have any great pictures or anything to demonstrate from that, but this is definitely the time of year with the heat that we have and the low amount of moisture many places are facing right now, that we'll start to see some benefits from that cover crop, and even just no-till and reduced till systems, both in keeping the soil moisture in the soil, but also the soil temperatures are going to be reduced as well. So that'll help the biology of the soil and keep the soil moisture going too.
Thank you. Our next question is one that I think Jim would be very passionate to speak about. What advice would you give a farmer who is wanting to start out planting cover crops? What are the steps?
Well, that's a great question, and one that we work with quite frequently as we add growers into the program, because we do have a lot of growers who are just starting off. So it's certainly, sometimes that advice will vary depending on where they are, whether in the state or what type of soils they're working with, and certainly what their goals are as well. If they're really just approaching it from wanting to do their part from a stewardship aspect, or wanting to reduce nitrates or erosion, or whether or not they've really decided there's a particular concern on their farm they're trying to adapt to. So I would give kind of 2 basic pieces of advice. It'd probably be best to start following a corn crop and go in there with cereal rye, as we've mentioned. So you harvest the corn crop, you're able to get in after that with a cereal rye cover crop. However you can get it on there. If you can drill it, great. If not, using a broadcast application, we talked about that a little bit, but that's usually a pretty low entryway into getting a cover crop out there. If you can broadcast it, hey, if you even need to incorporate it in, I know we're no-tillers, we like to reduce tillage, but you're starting off in cover crops. If you need to no-till it in, that's okay, or till it in a little bit, that's okay too. That cereal rye will overwinter for you. You want to come back that next year with soybeans, probably looking to no-till those soybeans into the cereal rye. Try to get an early termination on it your first time out. I know a lot of guys are doing a lot of things, planting green, letting that rye get really tall. But your first try out there, try to get it terminated when it's in that 12 to 18 inch range. Get in there, no-till your soybeans, and you should be in a pretty good spot to start off. It's a little bit trickier if you want to start off your next year being corn. There's a lot of cover crops that work very well ahead of corn, but they usually need to be seeded much earlier in the year. So you might be looking at something like an aerial application, but that would be a good way to start off, would be a winter kill cover crop ahead of corn, looking at putting oats or radishes out there. You may not see a greater response from the cover crop, but again, it's a great way to get started. Depending on what location you are in the country or the states, getting it out there at least by the 1st of October, hopefully a little bit earlier. You'll get some growth on it in the fall. It'll winter kill, and you won't have something in the springtime that you have to worry about termination. So certainly something we could talk at length about, but those are two kind of basic strategies to get involved with cover crops. By all means, reach out to me via the website. You can find my contact information there, and I'd be happy to talk about it more in depth with you.
Just to follow up on Jim's comment, we talk a lot about cover crops at soilhealthpartnership.org, and you'll find a lot of great information from Jim and his counterparts, the fellow field managers, who provide lots of great insights on cover crops and the journey with them. Next up is Jared. He is asking, have you seen anybody grazing those covers, and what have been the financial value? Has that been financially valuable?
Jim, you've got firsthand experience with that one.
Correct. So I farm with my family near Streeter, Illinois, and we actually started using cover crops as a forage feed. So back in the early 2000s, so we've had cover crops on our farm in one way or another for over 15 years. But we actually started into using cover crops as a livestock feed, trying to extend the grazing season, feed less hay, get more feed. So definitely a important way to see some economic benefit out of cover crops very quickly. So there's a lot of good strategies for that, but definitely a way to see that economic return very quickly because you're providing feed for your livestock. Now, to the Soil Health Partnership in particular, we've primarily concentrated on strip trials up to this time, which are a little more difficult to do grazing research on. So that is something, as Maria mentioned early on, we are kind of shifting gears there and looking at some different trial setups so we can start to capture some of that information. But again, I'll just leave the simplest advice in terms of getting some good livestock grazing out of it is still relying on that cereal rye, planting it after a corn harvest, and then looking to get some grazing out of it in the springtime is a really good method of getting some good cattle feed out of a cover crop, and then planting a soybean crop after that.
Thanks for that insight, Jim. And just a reminder, we have just a little bit more time for questions. So if you have a question, drop that into, if you're on Facebook, drop that into the comments, or if you're here on Zoom, go ahead and drop your question in. The next one is a great question. They're asking, what are some of the requirements or steps that a cover crop grower might take to be a candidate to be a testing site with the Soil Health Partnership?
I can start with that one, and then Jim, you can jump in. So we are expanding in a number of regions. Mostly we're focusing on expanding some of those side-by-side trials that Jim just talked about and we talked about a little bit earlier. So I'd say the best step is to get in touch with a field manager in your region and see if we are adding sites, depending on where you're located. We do have a lot of state partnerships and other partnerships right now to add new sites. So get on our website, shoot us an email. We have all of our field managers listed out on the website as well, and you could contact them directly.
I will just add that the best candidates that we're looking for is farmers who are interested in this information for themselves. We like to partner with growers that are interested in trying these, and they're really looking for a partner to go along with them to help them collect the data, help put things in a little better context so we can make good decisions based off the data that we're collecting.
And just to reiterate, you can find your local field manager at soilhealthpartnership.org. You can go there and then follow up with your local field manager. Kim has a question that, Maria, I'm going to send to you. When do you expect to have more financial data from the strip trials about profitability of the system?
So Kim, this year we're putting out a number of business cases that are focusing on individual farmer experiences with soil health practices. And as part of that, we're also going to be putting together a report this fall with the Environmental Defense Fund focusing on farm finance. And that's going to focus on a group of 5 to 10 farmers and their financial experiences with different soil health practices. So look for more on that this fall as part of that report and future business cases. And then next year we'll be bringing more information out across our network. We're working really hard to get this, but it's hard to get it from every single farmer. So we're progressively trying to get more and more info out there as we have it come in.
Thank you. And we have one last question, I believe, here back from Eric, a follow-up. And Jim, I'm going to send this your way. Have any regions in the U.S. had experience with the shortage of cover crop seeds?
I'm not aware at this point if there's any significant issues with shortages of cover crop seed. It does come up on occasion, usually depend. So for example, last year when we had prevent plant acres, we did see a shortage of warm season annuals. So we had an opportunity to get out there and get cover crops in very early in the year, which really opened up the window for the different types of cover crops that we could use. So we certainly saw some shortages last year in terms of things like sorghum, surdines, or millets, or things that people could get out there. It's very difficult because this is growing. You know, this is something where the percentage of acres that cover crops are on is still relatively low, and depending on the year, it can fluctuate dramatically. So we may see a doubling of cover crop acres from one year to the next, and that can create some situations of difficulty in getting cover crop seed available and to the growers when it's needed. So it does come up occasionally as a problem. We always encourage growers to order their seed early, have it ready to go so that you don't run into those types of issues. Because it's usually not the grower who ordered 4 months ahead of time that's struggling to get the seed. It's if it's a last minute decision, sometimes there's logistical issues in getting it out there. So it does come up. I'm not aware of any immediate concerns, and that doesn't mean that there isn't any this year, because it's always very susceptible to how well the cereal rye harvest is, or the logistics of getting things moved around. So certainly if you're a farmer, I would advise, get your cover crop seed booked early and you should be all right. But it is something that occasionally does come up.
Great. Thank you for sharing that insight. That concludes the questions that we have. And as a reminder, if you would like to download the complete 2019 SHP cover crop planting report, you can do that by going at the link here on the screen, the bit.ly cover crop report link here. And while you're at soilhealthpartnership.org, you can locate your local field manager, connect with us on social media, find upcoming webinars, listen to our podcast, and read our latest blogs on soil health. As you can see, we have a great team at the Soil Health Partnership with a lot of expertise, and we share a lot of information, and we encourage you to jump in and join the conversation with us. Thank you for joining us today.